my relationship with it has changed over time. So I was diagnosed when I think I was 14 and I was put on Adderall, and that didn't go well. I don't necessarily see it as a bad thing. I just see it as it's a superpower in some ways and then a disadvantage in others.
When we first had some discussions about creating this podcast, I really wanted to have a conversation about how living with ADHD can impact your work and your career. I wanted to speak about the ways in which understanding some of our natural tendencies of the ADHD brain can make you kind of pivot the way that you approach your work environments, the structure, and how you go about seeking out success. When we first spoke about who we wanted to talk to on this subject, Mark Manson was at the very, very top of the list. He was the best case scenario. So I'm very thrilled today to welcome him to Cloud. Mark Manson, for anyone who isn't aware, is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck and Everything is Fcked, a book about hope. What's the tally of those book sales now? It's surpassed 20 million?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, written in 65 different languages. Mark is also a podcaster, a YouTuber, and a self-proclaimed zero fuck giver. He creates a lot of content about philosophy and psychology, discussing everything from self-discipline to navigating a world full of distractions, impulsivity, routines, and living sober. Now, Mark, I love your content. I consume a lot of it. I'm a big fan of yours, and at risk of sounding like a fangirl by admitting that, something I have noticed is that I've only heard you speak about ADHD like a handful of times.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about having ADHD, or how do you feel about ADHD in general?
You know, it's my relationship with it has changed over time. So I was diagnosed when I think I was 14 and I was put on Adderall, and that didn't go well. I took it for about 1.5 years, maybe. And in hindsight, maybe the dosage was off. I don't know. Maybe back then, this was early 2000s. They weren't giving me the good shit. Like maybe they hadn't invented the good shit yet. So,
but also hormones of a 14-year-old.
Yeah, that too. But the side effects really caused problems. And I noticed that it really, I'm a very creative person. I'm a very spontaneous person. I have a sense of humor. And people in my life started noting that those things had kind of gone away. Yeah. And I actually had a teacher who pulled me aside, which is pretty astounding in hindsight because my grades immediately got much better. But one of my teachers kind of pulled me aside and was like, is this really worth it? Like you've kind of lost your personality a little bit, but you're making an A in my class. Is this really worth it? So by the end of high school, I went off it. And I think I kind of just tried to pretend it wasn't there. It was like, I'm just going to figure out a way. I'm just going to brute force my way through life, essentially, and succeed despite it. Screw ADHD. It's not even a thing. Some doctor just made it up to make a bunch of money. And I went through most of my 20s and probably early 30s. And it really wasn't until I started, my career kind of took off. And over the years, when I started to get deeper and deeper into research around psychology and neuroscience and understanding how neurotransmitters work and different aspects of the brain and everything, that I couldn't help but notice certain commonalities around ADHD and certain traits and behaviors and tendencies that I had. And so I think I'm 40 now, so I'd say really just in the last 5 years, I've started considering it and taking it a little bit more seriously. But also I don't necessarily see it as a bad thing or a handicap. I just see it as it's a superpower in some ways and then, a disadvantage in others.
I agree. And I think that as our awareness, even making this podcast, like the truth is that we kind of seesawed on this idea of there is so much awareness around it right now. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of content made on things like TikTok and Instagram and things that, will say like, oh, if you have these characteristics, like it might mean that you have ADHD. Mm-hmm. And like that might be the case. But it also might just be the case that some people have a certain behavioral characteristic that means that those people have that behavioral characteristic. And my fear of this kind of seesaw of awareness is that if you have so many people identifying with certain things like, the little tiny idiosyncrasies of ADHD, I worry that maybe that overexposure of awareness can actually subtract and kind of take away from people who actually need help. Like it makes it harder to triage when some people that experience, either a more severe form of ADHD or perhaps their symptoms are just a little bit harder for them to manage in their life. I do worry about the balance of saying like, oh, everyone, let's all identify with it. And
Yeah.
it has been something that we discussed a lot before creating this podcast. And I think I just wanted to provide other perspectives about ADHD for either people that have it or people that love someone who has it. And something that I think a lot of us do have in common is that we tend to crave new and quite intense experiences. We seem to be quite impulsive. We love a sense of adventure. I euphemistically used to say that I was very spontaneous, and I thought that
Yes.
was a great thing. But how has impulsivity impacted your life and your career?
Oh, it's funny. Every time I've taken a personality test, my openness to experience or like need for novelty is just off the chart. It's like 99th percentile. It's just maxed out completely. And that's always been true. I've always been a thrill seeker. I've skydived half a dozen times, bungee jumped, gone like to all these crazy. I was just telling you I was in the Northern Territory and out in the bush, like with this Aboriginal tribe doing all these crazy things. It's my brain gets bored very easily. And depending on the context, that can be either a very good thing or a very bad thing. And I think one thing that I've had to learn over the years is be extremely aware of those good contexts and bad contexts. In the context of being creative, being bored easily is actually a great thing because you will dig deeper and find more interesting stories or cool angles or come up with strange concepts that, are a little bit off the wall. But if you're in a context of, a school classroom or a boring 9 to 5 or, I don't know, going out to bars and parties, that impulsivity, that need for novelty, that craving for excitement all the time, it can work against you. So the negative side of that is I'm definitely somebody, I think at this point in my life, I can clearly look back and say I partied way too much. I drank way too much. I did too many drugs, chased too many girls. And like, this isn't a moral judgment. It's just like, yeah, dude, was that necessary? No, it was not necessary. Like you probably could have been using your time and energy in more productive ways. So that's the other side of the sword, I guess.
Yeah, and I think also, especially when it comes to your work life, like for myself, I used to be a medical researcher and I wasn't aware that I had ADHD at the time. I definitely wasn't diagnosed and medicated. And I found that, the repetition of science, it has to be repetitive because otherwise it's not a very good experiment and you can't use the results. And now looking back on that in hindsight, I've realized that I navigated my way to a job that had kind of inbuilt novelty as a way to counter how I naturally felt about novelty. Did you have a similar experience in your working life specifically?
I've never held a real job for more than a few months, so and
We're
I'm
not
sure
9 to 5ers, are we?
I'm sure my ADHD is a huge part of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's I mean 100%. It's just I had a desk job for a grand total of like 6 weeks of my life, and I think I made it 2 days before I wanted to quit. And then when I eventually got fired or let go, I wasn't even upset about it. I was like, well, I'd rather be broke and unemployed and have fun than like be fucking stuck here.
Yeah. I've always been curious about, because I have heard you say that you are not on medication. And truthfully, I actually ended up messaging your co-host, Drew. And I said, how the fuck did Mark write books without meds? Like, what? I tried to write a thesis.
Yeah.
And I've never felt more mind numbed in my life. I was just like, how do you spend so much time on the one project? We love instant gratification. There is not instant gratification in a book. I'm curious about how you got through the process of writing.
Well, first of all, I think one is just a very deep love of writing itself. Like writing, to me, there is kind of an endless novelty in the telling of a story or an explanation of a concept. Books are extremely hard. And yes, there are days where it's kind of excruciating to sit down and actually type on the screen. But the actual act of writing in many ways is explaining a concept or telling a story and then going back and telling it in a different way and then going back again and telling it in a third way and then trying to figure out which one of those ways is the best. Is there a way to combine them? Like, what if you threw in this, weird concept and made this connection? So there is kind of a very abstract, I think, intellectual novelty that can happen within writing or with any sort of kind of creative endeavor. And we could get into the details of just like my odd productivity function, but it's definitely reared its head in all sorts of ways throughout my career. Like I've had to adapt my work habits to my brain, not the other way around.
Something you just mentioned a little while ago was that you experienced a little bit of a period of your life where substances were a big part of it. You know, you love to party, you love to drink. Up to you whether you want to allegedly say,
Sure.
we used to love taking drugs.
Yeah.
There is some research that says that people with ADHD are a little bit more prone to substance use issues.
Yep.
How did you navigate that, and what was it that led you to wanting to become sober?
Well, with harder drugs, I never had as much of a problem. I think from the very beginning, as somebody, I've had people in my family who were addicts, and I grew up in a part of the U.S. where there was some addiction around. So I think I was wise enough at that age to know that when I tried all these things, it was going to be a temporary thing. It's like, okay, this is fine to do when you're 22 and just having a wild weekend. Like, this is not a lifestyle.
I love that even your drug use was novel.
Yeah.
There was no long-term commitment to this.
And it really was, it was almost like a psychological experiment. Like, I really did have this attitude of like, I want to try everything at least once, just to know. And in hindsight, that was probably irresponsible, but I did. And some of it I did more than others, but really the only thing that actually kind of sunk its hooks into me without me realizing it was alcohol. And I drank pretty heavily for 10 or 15 years. And I was very functional. Like I was never out of control or waking up in a ditch or starting fights or anything. I'm a very functional, happy drunk. And so it makes me more social. It makes me like people more. I actually am a fucking great writer when I'm drunk.
Interesting.
Like it enhances creativity.
Yeah, I guess that inhibition.
So I never really saw it as a downside. It never felt out of control. And so I never felt like I had a problem. And it really wasn't until I got into my late 30s and all these health issues started cropping up that I realized that like actually, I was damaging my body quite a bit. So I gave up drinking about 2.5 years ago. It initially started as simply like a 30-day challenge that was implored by my trainer at the time. I was trying to lose weight, and he was like, look, dude, you can do all the things right, but if you keep going out and drinking every weekend and having a glass of wine every dinner, you're not going to get anywhere, right?
Yeah.
So I gave it up for 30 days, and the effect on me mentally and energy-wise was like so profound that I was like, oh, maybe I'll do like 3 or 4 months. And so I did that, and the benefits just kept accruing, and I basically haven't had a drink since. And what I've realized since I got sober is that I think actually a lot of my alcohol use was kind of medicating the ADHD. First of all, alcohol is a rush of dopamine, and just the act of being buzzed itself is a feeling of novelty. It makes the boring same old things feel novel and exciting again. And so there's that aspect to it. I also think that the depressive aspects of alcohol maybe dulled some of the other aspects of ADHD when I wasn't drinking, when I was, say, a day or two later, or when I was hungover. Like I didn't have this constant craving to like be doing something new all the time. It was like I was tired, I was exhausted, I was hungover. So I think part of the drinking was just a way to medicate my mind to a certain extent. And one of the many unexpected things that came up when I stopped drinking was I started getting bored again all the time, very easily. And
was it just the people you were around, you realized that they weren't all that entertaining?
Well, that's part of it.
The social circle slightly changed.
Yeah, I mean, that is, there's a whole, I mean, it's, people you thought you liked, suddenly you're sober, you don't like them anymore. Activities, hobbies you thought you really liked, suddenly sober, you don't really like them anymore. So there's definitely like a little bit of an identity crisis that comes along with it. But I also noticed that there was like kind of this antsiness that came back that I hadn't really felt since I was a teenager. So I actually feel like in a lot of ways, and again, this kind of comes back to like why this topic has become relevant in my life again, is because I think I'm more aware of its effects on me because I'm not drunk or hungover all the time.
Yeah, Mark, I had quite a similar experience, but I think I got there from a very different way in that I was diagnosed and medicated just over a year ago. Similar. I actually quite like my personality when I'm drunk. I was
Yeah.
never overly emotional. I always had so much fun. Always used to say, like, no, I don't get anxiety because I would wake up in the morning and it wasn't like I regretted any things that I'd said or done or nothing too bad. I mean, sometimes there's things that you think you could have done better, but,
Yeah,
you know.
we've all got that one story. Yeah.
I think I've got a couple more than one, but I didn't
That's another
necessarily.
podcast.
Yeah, I mean, we've done those ones, the regrets. But it wasn't something that I necessarily felt like I needed to change. And I definitely didn't think that it was an issue in my life until I was medicated. And this really strange thing happened to me. I lost my desire to drink. And I mean, I guess I rationalized it in my own brain by saying, oh, okay, well, it's likely, maybe like, you know, scientifically that you used to crave dopamine highs from
Right.
drinking. Now you're medicated, you're probably just a little bit more stable in that way.
Yeah.
But it's been really interesting for me to listen to you speak about this kind of sober journey that you've been on, because I feel like I've experienced a lot of the effects in the same way. But a part of me is not as proud of myself because I don't feel as though I made the active decision to better my life. I feel like it kind of happened by accident as a result of the medication.
Sure.
And I do wonder whether if I were to go off of meds, would that craving nature come back? And it's not even like I never felt like I craved alcohol. I just craved being out and having fun with my friends, and I used to do it a lot.
Yeah.
And I do wonder whether that would come back. And it makes me wonder, when you make these changes in your life, do you have to really stick to your habits, or are you a little bit more like loosey-goosey, you let yourself kind of flow with the wind?
Oh, I definitely let myself flow. I'm a big believer that most goals actually shouldn't be accomplished. The point or the value of a goal is the directionality it puts you on. The vast majority of the time, as you pursue a goal or try to build a habit, what you discover halfway through is that actually that's not the thing. It's not going to make you as happy as you thought it was, but it taught you something about yourself, and actually this other goal over here is the one that you should be pursuing. So I see goals very much as like just part of the learning process. But I also, part of that's my personality. Like, I thrive under a little bit of chaos. I don't like structure.
For anyone who has come over here from Life Uncut, there's been a joke between our team for years.
Yeah.
That we always say we thrive in chaos. It's there would be people laughing right now being like, oh, Keisha's in good company.
Yeah. I can't tell you how many times, as you know, especially like being in the personal development niche, like I am exposed to so many people in my industry who they have got these like, you know, crazy morning routines, and this is how you build like the perfect day, and this is how you be productive, and you work in these sprints and use this technique to do this and that. And like, I've tried all of it. All of it. I've like structured, I've time boxed my calendar to hell and back. I have implemented like rigid schedules and alarms and notifications, and we're going to do this for 45 minutes and then take a 10-minute break and all this stuff. And like none of it lasts for more than 3 days because it makes me miserable. I'm like, this is terrible. This is terrible.
What a
like
boring way to live.
the first time I tried Pomodoro, I got to like that's where you do the 50-minute sprint and then take a 10-minute break. I got to the end of the 50 minutes and I was like, I fucked around for the first 40 and now I'm having fun. Why would I stop? This is the worst productivity hack I've ever seen.
Funny.
And look, like I don't even think you necessarily have to be diagnosed with ADHD for this to be a really salient point, is that like I think it's so important for each individual to understand kind of how they're wired, how their own brain works. Like, what are the best situations and environments that you respond to, and how do different techniques and disciplines affect you? Like, there are things that keep me productive that I would never recommend to anybody just because my brain's weird.
What kind of things?
My biggest one, so I discovered this in uni. I noticed that I had a lecture, it was like a history lecture, and the professor was a great lecturer, but it was like a 90-minute or 2-hour class, and I fell asleep in every single class. Like, I couldn't, even though it was interesting and he was great, every single class I would just get bored and nod off and pass out. And then one day I don't even remember why, for whatever reason, I brought a crossword puzzle. And I started doing the crossword puzzle in class. And then like whenever he said something really important or relevant, I would like stop the crossword and then I go like take the notes on the lecture and then I go back to the crossword. And I paid attention the entire 2-hour lecture. I had notes for everything he talked about. It was perfect. For the first time, and for the first time in my life, I'm like, I actually just nailed a 2-hour lecture. I have notes on everything. Like, this has never happened before. So I started bringing crosswords to all my lectures. And pretty soon, I'm like, my notebooks are full of all the notes, and I'm like able to study everything. And what I learned is that, coming back to the novelty thing, is I get bored easily, right? So let's say my attention span is such that I can handle maybe 5, 6, 7 minutes of lecture before my brain starts checking out. Well, as soon as the brain starts checking out, if there's nothing else for it to go to, it just goes to sleep. But if there's something else that I can go to, say a crossword puzzle or a Sudoku or whatever, spend 2, 3, 4 minutes on that until I get bored. Then I go back to the lecture. And by that point, it's like things haven't progressed super far in the lecture over 2 or 3 or 4 minutes. And so when I come back to it, I'm engaged again. And I'm like, oh, this is novel again. And so it's like leveraging that novelty. So whenever in my business, anything that's not creative, emails, edits, giving feedback to the team, writing memos, basic stuff like that, I always do 2 things at the same time. I never, like, if I'm checking email, I never just check email. I'm checking email and catching up on Slack messages. If I'm catching up on Slack messages, I'm like also revising social media content. Like, and it's what I do is I do one for 5 or 10 minutes until my brain starts to get bored and crave novelty. And then I go back to the other one and I do that for 5, 10 minutes until my brain craves novelty. And then I go back again. And that's how I stay productive for multiple hours at a time. It's the only way I've ever found that actually works for me.
Is that just for, like, I would say menial tasks,
Yes.
like small tasks? If there was something that required a lot of attention, maybe it was one of your writing days or like a heavy production edit or something
Right.
like that. Does it work if you're to pick up your phone and, like, do you end up in a scroll hole like everyone else? What's the limit of the distraction, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's dangerous too, right? Because it's sometimes I'll like justify to myself, well, I'll watch this YouTube video, because this also happens with media. Like, I can rarely sit through an entire movie or TV show without task switching my brain onto something else for a period of time. And so if I try to integrate that into work, it can be disastrous, because now I'm just like fucking around on YouTube half the day. And like that doesn't go very well. So I have to be like very careful and confined in terms of like what I allow myself to do and what I don't. What I've noticed is that when I'm with other people, that keeps me engaged. Like if I'm in a meeting, I don't need to like pull out my phone every 5 minutes. Like this podcast, right? Like I don't feel any need to like.
For anyone only listening, Mark hasn't pulled out a Sudoku book or a
Excuse me
crossword.
while I read this book for 5 minutes.
What, 5
You're
across?
boring me. So like when I'm in meetings or creative meetings or discussions or whatever, like it's not an issue. In deep creative work, it's not an issue. But what I notice with deep creative work is it takes a lot for me to get the flow. And then once I'm in flow, I'm great. But it takes me quite a bit to get there.
Mark, I've heard you speak a lot about, and it's kind of off the back of what you're saying right now, about self-discipline being more realistic approach than extreme willpower.
Mm-hmm.
You just said, like, I have to be careful of the limits of what my distractions are and how far deep I get into them.
Mm-hmm.
How much do you feel like you have control over your own willpower, and why do you rely more on self-discipline?
I don't think I mean, willpower, in my opinion, and there's a lot of research that backs this up, but willpower is a finite resource. It takes a lot of mental energy to force yourself to do something that you don't feel like doing. And that energy runs out like anything else. Like it runs out at a certain point. It's like, if you go to the gym, you probably have 45, 50 good minutes, and then everything after that's going to get a lot worse. And I think it's the same with willpower. So I think willpower needs to be deployed very selectively and carefully. And if you find yourself relying on willpower day in, day out, A, you're probably exhausted and burnt out, and B, that's just a bad strategy. So this is where habits come into play, environment comes into play. So there have been periods in my life where social media or my phone have been a problem. And I just I make a rule. I'm like, when I'm working, phone's in the other room, and I block social media. I'll block social media sites on my work computer until it stops being a problem, right? in a way, like I wrote about this in my second book, but like there's like an adult part of our brain, and then there's kind of like the child monkey version of our brain, and they're both there. You can't shut one off for very long. So as long as that child monkey part of your brain is there, if it keeps winning the argument, you need to treat it like a child and set rules and boundaries and punishments for yourself. And that's the way I see it is, you know, I've been screwing around all week on my phone. So no more phone privileges on work days. I leave it in the other room. And then rules. It's good to get explicit about rules. Like this is, you know, on my lunch break, these are the things I'm allowed to do. These are the things I'm not allowed to do. And like explicitly write them out for yourself. Don't just, you know, think about them or whatever.
It's so shit, isn't it? Like,
It is,
think for
but
people with ADHD, a lot of us who crave novelty, who sometimes don't like routines and structure, having to rely on self-discipline, it can be very challenging. It's something that I think I've really had to try and implement a lot of strategies. It's something that I never quite feel like I'm winning at. You know, for me, it's always going to be something that I have to keep reminding myself of, and I'm probably going to fuck up along the way, and I'm going to need to bring myself back to a more disciplined state.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of stuff you don't have to just do rules and punishments. You can do rewards as well. So like I'll make little deals with myself. So like let's say a new album comes out that I'm really excited about. I'll make a deal with myself. I'm only allowed to listen to that album while I write.
Bribes. That's
exactly.
effective.
Exactly. Or if there's a YouTube video that's up that I really want to watch, but it's like 30 minutes or something, I make an agreement with myself that you can only watch this video after the work is done. And it's just little things like that. I don't know. I find it helpful. Like I don't stick to them 100% of the time. Like I'm human. I fuck those up too. But like I just find them effective. Again, it's kind of like treating yourself like a child, you know?
It's kind of gamifying it.
Yeah.
Which gives you a bit of a dopamine rush.
Yeah.
Just before you go, Mark, I really wanted to ask you about your productivity, how you schedule your workday. You've kind of touched on it a few times, but let's say hypothetically you're back home, not in Australia, and you wake up and you've got a workday ahead of you. How do you attack it?
So this is another place where the conventional advice just never worked for me. So everybody's, all of the productivity guru advice is start with the most important thing, block out all distractions. I've found that my brain needs time to warm up. Like if I sit down and try to like write the most important thing in my career at 6 a.m. or whatever time it is, it's going to be terrible. Like it's just going to be a mess and I'm going to be miserable. So I actually start my day with the lowest stakes tasks, usually checking email, catching up on messages. It's super simple, doesn't require a whole lot of brain power, takes maybe 30 minutes to an hour. And then once I feel warmed up, like my brain's running, I've been caffeinated. That's the other thing, caffeine. Like I medicate myself with caffeine. It's not quite as good as the real shit, but
it can really help.
It gets
Oh I have to be careful if I take my meds in the morning. I've got to really wonder whether the caffeine is going to push me over the edge a little.
Yeah,
but it does. It kind of like it stimulates you. It makes sense. You know,
totally.
It's a form of stimulation.
It's a huge help. You know, maybe once I'm an hour and a half in, then I sit down, then I block off everything and like, okay, I really need to focus on this thing for a few hours. You know, whether it's a video edit or writing a script or, you know, outlining a book or something, you know, it's probably 7:30 or 8 a.m. until lunchtime. That's like the real creative work period. And then afternoon is usually for meetings, tying up loose ends, small tasks, checking in with people, interviews, stuff like that.
I recently heard one of your episodes. You had a guest on. And the reason I've laughed so much during this episode is because sometimes when I hear your podcast, I'm like, is Mark inside my brain? Like, he just articulated in a much better way than what I could exactly how I feel. And what I laughed at the time was you were having a discussion with him and with Drew about time blocking and applying your calendar to time blocking. And in my head, I thought, I've tried it.
Yep.
I've tried it and I never felt more like a failure.
Yep.
Because I would set, you know, the night before I paid for the proper way to do it on my computer so I could set it all out and it's all color coded and I tried to gamify it, right? And I would wake up in the morning and I'd look at the first thing and I'd go, no.
Yep.
I don't want to do that from 8 till 9.
100%. Yeah.
I do have the motivation to do this other thing.
Yeah.
And so it's made me laugh along hearing people who are, experts in this space say this is how you should do it, because I've realized that a to-do list for me is the best thing. A to-do list that I'm able to shift it around.
Yes. You can manipulate the to-do list to motivate yourself and, break up tasks across multiple. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And maybe it's our brains, but it's funny. That's my friend Neer. We did an episode with him, and he's just a huge time boxing proponent. And of course, he's like, this is what the research says and all this stuff. And I'm like, yeah, that's great, dude. It's funny because I tried to do that here in Australia. Like, I'm here. My schedule's insane here. Yeah. I have all this media that I'm doing. I'm doing these talks and events. Obviously, I'm switching time zones all over the place. And there's a bunch of stuff that I got to get done in the meantime. And so when I first got here, the first morning, I opened up my calendar and I started like time boxing. I'm like, okay, well, I've got 2 hours between this interview and this appearance. So like, this is when I'm going to do this. And then I'll fit the gym in here that night. And like, anyway, I set up my whole calendar for the entire trip. And I didn't even make it a day. And it's terrible now because now every time I pick up my phone, there's like multiple calendar notifications for all the shit that I didn't do. And I'm just like, this is
what I hate about it.
This is so annoying.
My whole life I've spent wondering why I can't do things to the same time periods that everyone else can. Now I'm just making myself feel like shame about not being able to achieve the goals I set out for myself.
Totally. And yet somehow everything is getting done. How? I don't know, but it is.
I think for me, the way I get things done is that I have found a job that's very time sensitive. I've got a lot of deadlines.
Yeah.
And that's almost, and I am very fortunate and very privileged in the sense that I found a job where my days that have deadlines, I work like a dog because, it has to be done. You almost get that thrill, right? You've got a time sensitive thing to do. And then the days where we're not in studio, we're not recording, we're not editing, I have a lot more freedom. And I am very fortunate in the sense that my bosses, some of which are here right now, so allow me to do that, Right. And I think that was something that I really wanted to end our conversation on is for people who do have an ADHD brain, or maybe you just have a lot of the tendencies that seem to come with creativity or like some of the impulsivity that, we tend to have. What is your advice for how they should approach their work and seek out something that will bring them a sense of fulfillment and purpose?
I mean, the best advice I can give is just really try to learn and understand your own mental tendencies on a very base level and try to understand them without judgment. Like, I think that's a mistake that a lot of people fall into, especially if you're neurodivergent. Like you're like, wow, all the experts say I should be doing it this way, but that never works for me. There must be something wrong with me. And it's like, no, there's not something wrong. You're just different. The same way, some people are tall enough to play in the NBA. Like, I don't beat myself up for not being tall enough to play in the NBA. Like, I just figure out something else to do. So I think it's really important to just try to be as objective as possible about how your own brain works and cater whatever your goals are, whatever your career is, try to mold that around your brain and not try to sit there and change your own wiring to fit some preconceived notion of what a productive person is.
I really love that advice. Thank you for it. And thank you so much for being so generous with your time here. I know it is extremely limited. We are very, very grateful to have taken half an hour of it. You can hear more from Mark on his podcast, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck podcast, which is also on YouTube. I really love to watch that one. I've recommended it on Life Uncut quite a few times. You can find more video content from Mark on his personal YouTube channel by searching Mark Manson, and you can get his books literally everywhere in one of the 65 languages that they are published in. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.